This is a family heirloom, she always said when handing me that carefully wrapped box every December 25th. Same size, same wrapping paper, same nervous smile on her face. By the time I turned 25, I had a whole shelf dedicated to these identical porcelain dolls, 20 perfect replicas with their glassy blue eyes and Victorian dresses, all staring at me from my bedroom wall. I never questioned it. Families have their weird traditions, right? My buddies thought it was hilarious that my aunt kept giving me dolls well into my 20s, but I just shrugged it off. She was my dad's sister, the only family I had left after he died in that car accident when I was 5, and if collecting creepy dolls made her happy, I could live with it. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I was rushing around my apartment, trying to find my car keys before work, when my elbow caught the edge of the shelf. Time seemed to slow down as I watched doll number 15, or maybe it was 16, they all looked the same, tumble toward the hardwood floor. The crash was surprisingly loud for something so small. Porcelain scattered across my living room like tiny white teeth, and that's when I saw it. A small piece of paper, rolled up tight and yellowed with age, had fallen out of the hollow space where the doll's torso used to be. My hands were shaking as I unrolled it. The handwriting was my aunt's distinctive scrawl, but the words made my blood run cold. There was my full name at the top, written in faded blue ink, and below it a date, tomorrow's date, March 15th. Underneath that, in the same careful handwriting, were the words car accident, intersection of 5th and Main, 8:47 a.m. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at that piece of paper. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as some weird joke, but the paper was old, really old. The edges were brown and brittle, like it had been sitting in that doll for years. And my aunt had given me that particular doll when I was 12, 13 years ago. The rational part of my brain kept trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some kind of time capsule thing, a weird family tradition I didn't understand. But as I looked at the date again, my stomach dropped. Tomorrow was March 15th, and I drove through the intersection of 5th and Main every single morning on my way to work, always around 8:45 a.m. I called in sick that day and spent the rest of it pacing around my apartment, occasionally glancing at the broken doll pieces I'd swept into a corner. The slip of paper sat on my kitchen table like a ticking bomb. Every time I looked at it, the same questions hammered through my head. How could my aunt have known to write tomorrow's date 13 years ago? And why would she predict my death? That evening, I drove across town to her house. She lived in the same small cottage where my dad had grown up, surrounded by the kind of overgrown garden that made the neighbors whisper about property values. I'd been avoiding her calls for weeks, not intentionally, just caught up in my own life, but now I needed answers. She answered the door before I could knock, like she'd been watching through the window. Her face was pale, more lined than I remembered, and there was something in her eyes that made my chest tight with anxiety. Without saying a word, she led me into her cluttered living room and pointed to the armchair by the fireplace. The house smelled like dried herbs and old books, the same smell I remembered from childhood visits. She disappeared into the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of tea that tasted like flowers and something bitter I couldn't identify. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound coming from the old grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, I pulled the paper from my pocket and placed it on the coffee table between us. She looked at it for a long moment, then closed her eyes and rubbed her temples like she had a headache. What she told me next changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Update 1. The women in our family had always been different, she explained. Not witches exactly. She hated that word, but sensitive to things that hadn't happened yet. Her grandmother could see deaths coming weeks in advance. Her mother had dreams that showed her accidents before they occurred, and she had inherited the gift, along with the responsibility that came with it. For the past 20 years, she'd been seeing my death in dreams. The same death, over and over again, but always on different dates. Sometimes it was a car accident, sometimes a fall downstairs, sometimes a heart attack at 28. The visions changed, but the outcome was always the same. I would die young, just like my father. So she started making the dolls. Each one contained a prediction, a specific date and method of death that she'd seen in her dreams. But here's the part that made my head spin. By giving me the dolls, by placing those predictions inside them, she was somehow deflecting fate. The death she predicted would happen to someone else instead, usually a stranger whose name she'd never know. For 20 years, she'd been saving my life by sacrificing others. I felt sick as she explained how it worked. The universe demanded balance, she said. Death had to happen on schedule, but it didn't always have to happen to the right person. By writing down my predicted death and sealing it in a doll, she was essentially offering up a substitute. Some random person would have a sudden heart attack, or their brakes would fail, or they'd slip in the shower at exactly the moment I was supposed to die. She'd kept me alive by killing strangers. The teacup slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor, but neither of us moved to clean it up. I couldn't process what she was telling me. 20 innocent people had died because my aunt wanted to keep me safe. 20 families somewhere had lost someone they loved because she couldn't bear to lose the last piece of her brother. But then she told me about the 20th doll, the one I'd broken that morning, and everything got worse. This time, the vision had been different. Instead of seeing my death, she'd seen my father's accident from 23 years ago. The same intersection, the same time, even the same weather conditions. But in her dream, there had been 2 cars involved in the crash, my father's blue sedan and another vehicle she recognized. It was her own car. She'd been driving to the grocery store that morning in 1985 when she saw my dad's car approaching the intersection. Some instinct made her slam on her brakes, and she watched in horror as his car skidded through the red light and into the path of an oncoming truck. If she hadn't stopped, if she'd continued through that intersection like she'd planned, the truck would have hit her instead. My father had died because she'd unconsciously saved herself. For 23 years, she'd been carrying that guilt, convinced that she'd somehow caused his death by avoiding her own. When the visions of my future death started coming, she saw it as a chance for redemption. She would save me the same way fate had saved her, by deflecting death onto others. But the 20th doll was different. Instead of a slip of paper with my name and tomorrow's date, it contained something else entirely. She reached into a small wooden box on the side table and pulled out a photograph, old and faded, but clearly showing my father standing beside his blue sedan on the morning he died. On the back, in her handwriting, were the words I'd found. On this one, I won't interfere. Update 2. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photograph of my dad, looking so young and alive just hours before he died. The way he was smiling in the picture, like he didn't know what was coming. Like he trusted the world to keep him safe. My aunt's words kept echoing in my head. She wasn't going to interfere this time. After 20 years of deflecting my death onto strangers, she was going to let fate take its course. The question that tortured me all night was simple. Why now? I spent the early morning hours researching everything I could find about our family history. My aunt had mentioned that the women in our family had always been different, but I'd never paid attention to those old stories. Now I was digging through genealogy websites and old newspaper archives, looking for any mention of unexplained deaths or strange coincidences. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a pattern going back 5 generations. Women in our family lived unusually long lives. My great-great-grandmother had died at 97, her daughter at 94, and so on. But the men died young. Always in accidents, always unexpectedly, usually in their 20s or 30s. Car crashes, falls, drowning accidents, sudden heart attacks. The details changed, but the timing was consistent. And in every case, there was a woman in the family who had recently lost someone close to her, but survived some kind of near miss herself. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. The women in our family were trading deaths, just like my aunt had been doing for me. They saved themselves or their loved ones by unconsciously redirecting fate onto others. It wasn't intentional, at least, not at first, but it had been happening for over a century. My aunt was the first one to figure out how to do it deliberately. But here's what really scared me. According to the family records, this ability came with a price. Every woman who used it eventually reached a breaking point where the guilt became unbearable. They would stop deflecting death and let it claim the person they'd been protecting. It was like the universe demanded payment for all those years of interference. My great-grandmother had protected her son for 15 years before letting him die in a factory accident. Her daughter had saved her husband for 12 years before he drowned in a boating accident. The pattern held true for every generation. Eventually, the protector would step aside and let death collect what it was owed. 20 years was the longest anyone had ever managed to keep someone alive. I was still staring at my computer screen when my phone rang. It was 6:30 a.m., and my aunt's name appeared on the caller ID. Her voice sounded older than it had the night before, tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. She asked me to meet her at the cemetery where my father was buried. Said she had something to show me that would explain everything. The drive across town felt like it took forever. I kept checking the clock on my dashboard, acutely aware that according to that slip of paper, I was supposed to die in less than 2 hours. Part of me wanted to just keep driving, to head for the highway, and put as much distance as possible between myself and that intersection. But I needed to understand what was happening to my family. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning light. My aunt was already there, standing beside my father's headstone with a small shovel in her hands. The ground in front of his grave had been disturbed, like someone had been digging. What she'd unearthed was a metal box, old and corroded but still intact. Inside were more photographs, dozens of them, showing members of our family going back generations. But these weren't normal family photos. They were all taken on the days those people died, and in every picture, you could see a woman in the background, always at a safe distance, always watching. My aunt was in the photo of my father's accident, standing on the sidewalk across the street. Her grandmother was visible in a picture of a house fire that killed her brother in 1923. The pattern went back and back, a visual record of women watching their loved ones die while they themselves remained untouched. But the last photograph in the box was the one that made me understand everything. It showed my aunt as a young woman, maybe 25 years old, standing outside a hospital. She was holding a baby, me, and behind her, barely visible through a window, was a man lying in a hospital bed. The date stamp on the photo was from 3 days after I was born. She'd been protecting me since birth, not just from the death she'd seen in visions, but from an earlier death that was supposed to happen when I was just a baby. According to the medical records she pulled from the box, I'd been born with a rare heart condition that should have killed me within the first week of life. But she'd deflected that death too. Some other baby, somewhere else in the world, had died of the same condition on the exact day I was supposed to. She'd saved me before I was old enough to even know I was in danger, and she'd been saving me ever since. 25 years of deflected deaths. 25 families who had lost someone so that I could live. Final update. The truth about why my aunt decided to stop protecting me was more complex than I'd imagined. It wasn't just guilt, though that was certainly part of it. She'd been having new visions, ones that showed what would happen if she continued to interfere with fate. In her dreams, she saw me living a long life, growing old, getting married, having children. But she also saw the price that life would exact. Every year I lived beyond my natural lifespan would require more deaths to maintain the balance. Eventually, it wouldn't be just one person dying in my place. It would be dozens, then hundreds. The universe was getting impatient. She'd realized that by saving me for so long, she'd created a debt that would eventually consume entire communities. The longer I lived, the more death would be required to balance the scales. At some point, keeping me alive would mean orchestrating disasters that killed thousands of innocent people. She couldn't live with that possibility. But there was something else she hadn't told me the night before, something that changed everything about the choice she was making. The visions had shown her that I'd inherited the family ability. If I survived past my natural death date, I would start seeing the future deaths of people I cared about. And eventually, I would face the same impossible choice she'd been living with for 25 years. Did I want to save the people I loved by killing strangers? Did I want to become the architect of other families' tragedies? She was giving me a chance to escape that burden by letting fate take its course. I had an hour and 15 minutes to decide what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to run. I could skip work, avoid that intersection, maybe even leave town entirely. But my aunt had explained that deflecting a death you were supposed to face only delayed it. Eventually, fate would find another way to collect what it was owed, usually with interest. Another part of me was angry. 25 years of my life had been built on other people's deaths. Every birthday, every graduation, every moment of happiness had been purchased with someone else's tragedy. How was I supposed to live with that knowledge? But as I sat there in the cemetery, surrounded by decades of family secrets, I realized there was a third option my aunt hadn't considered. What if I could break the pattern instead of perpetuating it? I spent the next hour researching everything I could find about our family's history, looking for any instance where someone had found a different solution. Most of the records were sparse, but I found one interesting detail in my great-great-grandmother's diary. She'd written about a cousin who had refused to accept the family curse and had spent years trying to find a way to reverse it. The cousin had disappeared when she was 30, and the family had assumed she'd died. But there was no death certificate, no grave, no record of what had happened to her. She'd simply vanished from all official records, as if she'd never existed. What if she'd found a way out? With 20 minutes left before my predicted death time, I made a decision that would have seemed insane just days earlier. Instead of running from fate or accepting it, I drove straight toward that intersection. But I didn't go alone. I'd called every emergency service in the city and reported a gas leak at the intersection of 5th and Main. By the time I arrived, the entire area was blocked off. Police cars, fire trucks, and emergency crews had turned the normally busy intersection into a construction zone. No one could drive through that intersection at 8:47 a.m. because no one was allowed near it. I stood behind the police barricade and watched the clock on my phone tick past the moment I was supposed to die. 8:47 came and went, and I was still breathing. No car accident, no sudden heart attack, no unexpected tragedy. For the first time in 25 years, fate had been cheated without anyone dying in my place. The gas leak turned out to be real, a small leak that probably would have gone unnoticed for months if I hadn't called it in. The utility company thanked me for potentially preventing a major disaster. They had no idea I'd actually prevented a minor one. But the real test came later. Over the next few weeks, I monitored every death in the city, looking for the displaced tragedy that should have occurred when I avoided my fate. I checked obituaries, accident reports, hospital records, everything I could access. There were the usual deaths you'd expect in a city of 500,000 people, but nothing unusual. No spike in accidents, no mysterious heart attacks, no pattern that suggested someone else had died in my place. It seemed like the curse had simply stopped. My aunt was both amazed and terrified when I told her what I'd done. She'd never considered that the family pattern could be broken rather than just transferred to the next generation. For the first time in decades, she wasn't having visions of anyone's death, not mine, not her own, not the strangers who had been dying in our place. But she warned me that we might have just made the universe even angrier. If our family had been accumulating a death debt for over a century, and I'd just refused to pay it, there might be consequences we couldn't foresee. 6 months later, I'm still alive, and no one has died in my place. The dolls my aunt gave me are gone. I destroyed all 19 remaining ones without opening them, breaking the cycle of predictions and deflected deaths. She stopped having visions entirely, like whatever supernatural connection our family had to fate has been severed. Sometimes I wonder if I've actually solved anything, or if I've just delayed a reckoning that will be worse when it finally comes. But for the first time in my life, I'm living each day without the weight of someone else's death on my shoulders. I'm not sure if I broke a curse or just postponed a catastrophe, but I'm still here, and that has to count for something. The strangest part is that I never inherited the family ability to see future deaths. Maybe it died with the curse, or maybe it skips generations, or maybe I simply chose not to accept it. Either way, I sleep better at night knowing that I'm not carrying on a tradition of trading innocent lives for my own survival. My aunt still gives me gifts at Christmas, but now they're normal things: books, sweaters, gift cards to restaurants. No more dolls, no more predictions, no more family secrets hidden in porcelain shells. Sometimes I miss the certainty of knowing what was coming, even if it was always something terrible. Living without any knowledge of the future is scarier than I expected. Every day could be my last, and I have no supernatural protection keeping me safe. But it's also liberating. For the first time in 25 years, my life is completely my own. Every breath I take, every decision I make, every moment of happiness or sorrow belongs entirely to me. No innocent strangers have to die to keep me alive, and no future generations will inherit the burden of choosing between their loved ones and complete strangers. I broke the pattern, and somehow, we all survived it. At least so far.